Welcome to the show today. My name is Douglas Gabriel. Today's presentation is on a new book, a culmination for me, because it basically shows what we call anthropogenesis. It shows how human beings came to be and the different stages that they had to go through, and in particular, who were the cultural leaders of mankind, of humankind, throughout these great periods of time, which we now, with modern DNA research, as well as archaeomythology and many other historical advantages that we have this day, we are demonstrating what that true path was. Interestingly enough, Rudolf Steiner, through his secretary, Gunther Wachsmuth, created a book called The Evolution of Earth and Man. And in that book, which was written 100 years ago, he describes the exact things that have now been proven 100 years later through DNA research. And so we're going to talk about that today, because this Manu was the Noah of Atlantis. And so we like to call him the Noah of Atlantis, though Manu is a name that comes from ancient India that is really a long tradition of Manus. And this Manu that we're talking about is the Manu who ended up leaving in the fifth migration off of Atlantis as it was sinking in its last days in about 10,500 BC, when we have the Ice Age. And now, mind you, you might consider it crazy that we're going to talk about Atlantis today, but let's talk about the 2-mile-high wall of ice that scraped all of northern Canada down into America, created the Great Lakes, and then receded in 10,500 BC. So when we say Atlantis was in its final stages of sinking, it was a continent of sorts, and it broke up into islands and then started to sink. Well, we know from Rudolf Steiner, who had clairvoyant vision of the Akashic records, that he is able to go in and tell much, much more than anyone else has ever told about what happened on Atlantis, when it happened, and the differences between modern human beings and the Atlanteans, which some would call Cro-Magnon. Matter of fact, there's a new book that insinuates that. I'm not sure I go for that idea, because Rudolf Steiner describes in great detail what really happened in Atlantis. And I'm going to focus on that now, even though Scythianos, who was a student of Manu and left in the fifth migration along with Zarathustra, went to Ireland, which was then later called Hibernia, or insinuated in many writings as the land of Hyperboreans, which it really wasn't, but it was the land of the north. We'll get into that when we talk about Scythianos. But essentially, we need to address the question of Atlantis, because Noah of Atlantis, Manu, was in fact one of 14 Manus who are cultural leaders that were described in ancient India in a variety of different sacred texts. And so he was called by the ancient Indians Vaivasvata Manu. There are 14 Manus in any Manvantara, and he is the one that basically created our cultural infusions that went through the different epochs, cultural epochs that Rudolf Steiner describes. And now, the more we learn about history, the more we learn about archaeology and DNA and haplogroups, we find that Steiner was absolutely right, 100%. And to the point that he literally named the exact 3 places that they now say the theory, the out of Africa, the 3 Eves theory, point out. 3 exact spots. Well, Steiner, 100 years before that was discovered, pointed out where they were and where they came from. They came from Lemuria, and they went across Lemuria, which was in the Indian Ocean, across Africa to Atlantis, and that's how Atlantis was started. Now, no one besides a few theosophists and a few, well, basically theosophists who are studying ancient Indian texts, refer to these things. And when they do, they basically just make up some of it, per se, and others they take from ancient history and they elaborate on it. They basically build on it. They confabulate their own psychic imaginations and fantasy with these historical realities. Now, Rudolf Steiner himself, when he started teaching theosophy, understood that he needed to clarify the mistakes of others that had already written about Atlantis and Lemuria. As a matter of fact, in the beginning of his book, which was part of a series that he wrote for a magazine that he had, and it was called Atlantis and Lemuria, in the first lecture, he describes this. Now, I don't like to read long passages, but I need to read this. But first, let me set the stage. If you wish to study Atlantis and you look it up, you're going to find a person named Scott Elliott. And Scott Elliott was a theosophist, and he worked with C.W. Leadbeater. And C.W. Leadbeater would go into a trance. He did this with Annie Besant, also the head of the Theosophical Society at one point. And they would fantasize. They would imagine things. And so C.W. Leadbeater supposedly went back and read the Akashic records and or got some of the wisdom from the ancient masters. And he then worked with C.W. Leadbeater and Scott Elliott together. They worked to create this book. Now, this book is not accurate. The parts that are accurate are what are called the 7 races. Now, when I say races, I want to make sure this is absolutely understood by everyone. Steiner doesn't really believe in any race after Atlantis. So we will call those the 7 migrations from Atlantis. Others call them the 7 races of Atlantis. They're really very little like any race that we have now that we call races, which I don't really agree with. I would call those inspired folk spirits who are working with the geographical influences of any particular area that, in fact, create what we see as language arising, as well as the physiognomy of human beings that are very particular to specific geographical areas. And so when we're talking about Atlantis, there are, and I mentioned races, because in the great scheme of the divine plan called the Manvantara, there are 7 stages and 3 previous stages before our Earth. So when we look out on the Earth, this is the 4th stage. One could literally call it the 4th incarnation of the Earth. In the first stage, warmth was created. In the second, light. In the third, sound, which is also chemistry or valence, or essentially that could also be called magnetism, just like light in those days could be called electrostatic energy. So electromagnetism is sound, and then life. So we are in the stage of life. So we're in the 4th stage of the Earth's incarnation. It is the 5th stage that always is a marker of what the future will hold. The 6th and the 7th stages are usually stages that are declining stages, except in terms of incarnations of the Earth, but in terms of the smaller stages that happen, the 2 sets of smaller stages. When you reach the 6th and the 7th, you actually start going into decadence. You start not evolving and not being the cutting edge of evolution, but in fact, a note of a devolution, as it were, or just being in a holding status as those new capacities for the 6th and 7th cycles are developed, because we're not there yet. So if we talk about Atlantis, it first starts off with Rudolf Steiner pointing out that those 3 previous incarnations of the Earth were, in fact, recapitulated when the Earth was created this time. And they recapitulated, and he called them ancient Polaria, ancient Hyperborea, ancient Lemuria, ancient Atlantis. And those 4 stages are basically the stages that needed to happen to prepare us for what we need to do in the 4th incarnation of the Earth. And those were then the recapitulations that were the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th periods of Atlantis, of the incarnation of the 4th incarnation of the Earth that created those periods. So in Atlantis, it is the 5th migration off of Atlantis that is the cultural leading edge. And that's true with all the stages of 7, whenever you look at them. It is the 5th stage that carries things forward. So what do we have here? We have what Steiner would call the sinking of Atlantis and the fifth migration. I could give you the names of those migrations, which he did take from ancient Indian culture, which was incorporated in the book that was created by C.W. Leadbeater and Scott Elliott. And he sticks with those, but he does not stick with the descriptions of them, because the descriptions that they had, that Theosophists had, were basically fantasies. They weren't reality. They weren't what the Akashic record showed Rudolf Steiner. Now, when you look at what he says, it fits into all the ancient records. And we don't even know if Steiner had translations of those ancient records in his time. So did he have that from reading? Did he have it from study? No, he had it from direct perception. Now, this takes a leap of faith, but that's the reason we left this particular book on the Masters and Avatars, which was a part of the inside part of the series of from the works of Rudolf Steiner. We left it till the end because Manu is basically the father of all civilizations that we know of, or that we would call recorded history. But Scythianos is to become the Manu of the future. And when you look at Scythianos and his work with Manu and Zarathustra, it is the most astounding historical view that you can get, period. Because it tells you things that you cannot find in any history book. But when you go to look for evidence and you get knowledge and you get discoveries, and then you look at this anthropogenesis, this entire genesis of the human being that Rudolf Steiner describes, it fits 100% perfect. It fits with all the ages of geology, except that it's much, much quicker. It fits with the development of the human psyche and the soul capacities of thinking, feeling, and willing. It fits with the pre-earthly deeds of Christ, which gave human beings the capacity to stand upright, to speak, and to think. It gave us basically the foundation of everything we needed, except the last gift, which is the cutting edge future of humankind, which is to develop a free thinking consciousness. That, if you look into the past, didn't exist in the past for human beings. If you had an ego, then it was probably given to you as an overlighting of an angel, which is Manus, which is where they get the word Manu. Manu meant someone who was able to think like an angel in the realm of Manus, and human beings will in the future. Or it could be those beings might have been overlighted by an archangel, a folk spirit, as I mentioned. And that's what Manu, in one version of what Steiner gives and describes. We're not exactly certain, but we do believe that what he was saying was that Manu was somewhat overlighted by an archangel, but Manu was an avatar. Now, here is where we go into a great deal of work in this book to describe to you what a master is, what an avatar is, what a Manu is, what a bodhisattva is, because we as humans can rise up through these levels, but we cannot descend as an avatar. And so throughout all history, the entire Manvantara, we have 14 Manus who come down and lead culture. So culture wasn't just invented by human beings in Sumeria. No, that was an inculcation. It was an implanting, and basically the seed of culture given by Manu was given to Sumeria. So when you say the Sumerians started the first cultivars and growing plants and growing the fruits and vegetables that we have, no, that's not true. That was long before developed. Where Manu went when he left the sinking islands of Atlantis and took with him from the 7 oracles, Rudolf Steiner calls them, the 7 oracles, or the 7 planetary spirits, or he calls them 7 planetary regents, worked through the beings called the 7 Holy Rishis. Those Rishis were basically overlighted by these higher beings. So normally, when you saw Manu, you would know he's some kind of high avatar. He's like an archangel incarnated in a human body in Atlantis. But when you met the Rishis, Rudolf Steiner said, you would see just what looked to be normal beings. But when these spirits, these 7 planetary spirits, came into each of those 7 holy rishis, who represented each of the 7 major planets, they were able to work with Manu to combine the sun, because Manu was the sun oracle, and combine the other oracles into one teaching. That teaching then became what the seed that was inseminated into the ancient culture of India at first, and then to ancient Persia. And these are beyond what we would call the history of India or Persia, and then into Mesopotamia, or through the Egyptian, Chaldean, Babylonian, Assyrian cultural period. That also came from Manu, from what was called the City of Manu, in the what Steiner refers to it as the Central Asian Mystery Initiation Center. But we in today's age would say a city that was developed on the western edge of the lake called Lop Nor in western China, at the confluence of the Altai and the Tarim rivers, which flow through the Tarim Basin. And when they conjoin, it's right before this city. And so Steiner pointed out that when Manu, the Noah of Atlantis, was pulled by the great fish, which was an incarnation of Vishnu, Apsu was his name. That way you used Apsu to throw a rope around the horn, the one horn coming from the great fish, which of course one might imagine is a narwhal, a whale with one horn. Who knows? But the stories of Noah having the unicorn swim right alongside him because the unicorn didn't get on board of Noah's Ark. You wonder, is that really just a reference to the ancient Indian story? Which that story is quite detailed and is found in the teachings of Manu. So in the book that we're talking about are the stories of the Manu Smriti. It's very hard for me to pronounce that word, but it's basically the books of Manu, or the laws of Manu. So ancient India was really created, the Harappan culture, which was dated back to between 9 to 10,000 BC in the major river valleys of India. They weren't developed there. They were developed, brought wholesale to them from the city of Manu in China on the Lop Nor Lake. Now, I've done research on this for many years, and I have found that there was a city there, but now it has been, basically, it's underwater because of a hydroelectric plant. And also, Manu had a library of 200 buildings. Rudolf Steiner referred to this. Blavatsky referred to it. The ancient Indian texts referred to it. And it was in the Tarim Basin, in the caves around the Tarim Basin, what we call the Tarim Basin now. So some of these caves have never been found, but some of them were, one of them was a library of 200 pyramid structures that were the library of Manu, which had all the wisdom of the ancient Atlanteans, what Rudolf Steiner calls the Tao, the language of nature, the magical language of nature. So Manu had that. And Manu put it in books and put it in these libraries in the Gobi Desert, on what was at that time referred to by ancient peoples, as well as later by Theosophists and Rudolf Steiner himself, as the White Island. So just north of the city of Manu was the White Island. Now you would say, okay, well, that proves Rudolf Steiner's wrong. No, it took a long time for them to figure out that the Gobi Desert used to be a sea. And the reason they know that is there are hundreds, if not thousands, of whale skeletons laying in the desert, the Gobi Desert. It was a sea at one point. And there's a highland there in the Gobi Desert, which seems to have possibly have been the highland that was called the White Island. That these libraries, these 200 libraries, were on the White Island. Well, now we have found in the Gobi Desert these 200 pyramids. They're in the exact spot that they should be, in the highlands of the Gobi Desert. And the fact that it was surrounded by water has been proven by all of this scientific research on the skeletons of the whales. As a matter of fact, the research that has come out of that is so astounding that they found that unicorns were land animals, and then they were like wolves, and then they went into the ocean and became narwhals and orcas. So the research there is astounding. It's only just beginning, really, when it comes down to it. And we have not found these libraries. Now, when Manu left Atlantis, he took what is called the southern route across Europe all the way to Central Asia. But the first thing he did was he took two of his best students, as well as the seven Holy Rishis, into islands near Ireland. And there, that's where the myth of Hyperborea probably comes from, or at least partially, that he created and established a school there, and he made sure that the wisdom of Atlantis would continue but be made into a new form, because on Atlantis everything was in a mist. And imagine the ice age created walls 2 miles high of ice that would scrape land clean. And at the same time, Atlantis was sinking. So when you look at the Atlantic ridge, that is what is the remnant. If you look at the Canary Islands, if you look at the Bimini Islands, you will actually find remnants of these things. And so now scientists and archaeomythologists are saying, oh, yeah, of course Atlantis existed, but they never said it did before. Lemuria, Scott Elliott's book is complete nonsense on that, and James Churchward's book on Mu, he calls it Mu, which he said came from ancient books from India called Nakal that he and only a few people ever saw, and then he gives incredible descriptions of Mu. Now, others have come along and also derived the theory that looking at all of the fauna, flora, and buildings around the world, especially in the East, it looks as if they all came from one place. That's why there's pyramids everywhere around the earth. They're discovering new pyramids every day, practically, certainly every week. They discover a new pyramid because of the new sensing devices they have for ground penetration with satellites. So they're discovering these ancient civilizations all the time. And as I said, that coincides with exactly what Rudolf Steiner said about these things. So when you talk about Manu, yes, you can't find his city anymore. It's underwater. But you can find some other cultural artifacts in the Turin Basin, in a number of places there in central China and in outer Mongolia, and north of there, where you will find the proof that back to 10,000 BC, culture was highly developed. As a matter of fact, we include in the book descriptions of what avatars and masters are, but we go back to a Buddha that no one seems to talk about, who was the creator of the Bon culture, B-O-N, or Bonpo. And that was Tampa Shinra Miwoche in 10,000 BC. Well, isn't it funny that all of a sudden, the first Buddha that we know of is a Buddha who lived in that area, who was known to breed horses and hemp and cannabis as the basis of their perennial of their annual crops. But of their perennial crops, you can find the Hunza Valley, Nagar, Gilgit, and you will find there that this ancient culture, 10,000 BC, really invented many of these things that we that we try to attribute to the Sumerians or other such people, which is not really true. So Tampa Shinra Miwoche, we include in this as one of the great leaders, but he didn't lead a migration. Manu led the southern migration to the Central Asian Mystery Initiation Center. Scythianos led the northern migration, which went all the way across Ireland, across all of Northern Europe, all through the steppes, all to Siberia, all the way to the Uyghur culture, across the Bering Strait. And they now know, of course, that many American Indians were, in fact, of this migration. Now, all along migration and the leader, Scythianos, it's quite different than Manu. Manu gave us really the structures to create cities, to create basically cities that were concentric circles, and on the inside, the very center, and around it were the seven mystery centers. This was replicated by the Harappian people. As a matter of fact, the Harappians, it's very strange, only in probably the last 10 years have they got much information on them in ancient India. And we know from Rudolf Steiner that two of the now extinct river valleys no longer, they haven't even been investigated. So the ones that we have demonstrate that in 9000 BC, they had a complete astronomy, astrology, they had street lights, they had batteries, they had multi-story buildings, they had complete plumbing. Those cities were so advanced that it is inexplicable to imagine that they developed out of themselves. They were given that culture. And when you look to the ancient Indians, they will talk about the original Brahmins, who were tall, blonde hair, blue-eyed, came out of the sky, as so many of these cultures will say, that they were started by a different group of people who came with a completely developed cultural plan. That was directly from Manu. So when Manu knew that culture was ready for another insemination and we were ready for another cultural period, he would send emissaries. Now you say, but what happened over thousands? That happened over thousands of years. How did that happen? He was incarnated many times. The priest kings of the ancient days were, in fact, the leaders who were in direct contact with the spiritual world. Many times they were avatars, or they were overlighted by an archangel, a folk spirit, or an angel at certain moments. And of course, we know that in the past, most people were generally clairvoyant. They had natural clairvoyance. So they had a capacity that we don't have anymore. And that's how they were built. They were such great megalithic builders. They built buildings that we can't even understand at this point. We have yet to scrape the surface of history, and certainly know little about prehistory. So when Manu taught, he gave what we would say intellectual culture that developed into what we know as the modern day, even into our own time. So Manu was the great leader of the past, but in the future, it will be someone else, and that is the being called Mani. And Mani is the being who created a syncretic religion in the Middle East that merged Buddhism, Christianity, and other religions, as well as the ancient teachings, and gave us really the antidote to working through conquering evil. And so Mani will be another Manu of the future, but in the future beyond that, in the sixth period, the Russian Slavic period, it will be Scythianos. He will be the Manu of that period. So imagine Scythianos goes all the way back in his awake intellectual consciousness to Atlantis, and then he inculcated culture in all of the peoples that he met. Now, mind you, there were plenty of people on the earth at the time of Atlantis. We focus in anthroposophy and spiritual science on the cultural advancements. We don't just look at all the people who were around at that time, and that's demonstrated by the references in the Bible that even Cain and Abel could go out and find a wife because there were other people in the area. Rudolf Steiner says that quite clearly. There were Aboriginal people all over the earth, but they were then acculturated by these great Manus, these great cultural leaders. So Scythianos's great, incredible gift is that just like Manu and just like Zarathustra, Scythianos incarnated numerous times into the Scythian people, who, by the way, have so many names that you can't track them. And that's why he's the hidden master. We are only now beginning to understand what the Scythians were, and we have almost no comprehension of who Scythianos was in terms of acknowledged history. But Rudolf Steiner gives us infinite details practically on these cultural leaders, because that's how the spirit is developed. So he had the capacity, Scythianos, that wherever he went, he didn't write things down like Manu did, or even the Persians through Zarathustra did. He did it through hexameter songs and poetry. So as you look if you wish to follow the migration of Scythianus, you should follow the oral traditions that were never written down. So what would they be? Well, those would be the traditions of the Druids, of the Drotten culture, the Trots, the Siberians, the shaman culture of Siberia and the steppes, um, all the way to the Indian cultures. So all of them worshipped, in a way, the further east you went, particularly, the sky god. And they worshipped this god who would ride on a horse across the sky. Tingris, he was called. But so this has been turned into many different gods. So this is the Norse mythology. It's the mythology of the Kalevala. It's the mythology of Sturluson Snorlason, who wrote down the poetic and prose Edda. It's all these stories that most people can't understand. But Rudolf Steiner said that in our age, we should study the Kalevala, which, of course, was a gift of Scythianus through the people in Finland or the north, the Lapland people, and that will tell us what we need to face as the challenge of our times. And when you study the Kalevala, you'll find that it's all about what happens in relationships and how is it that we awaken to plasma and the forging of the Sampo. Now, those words may sound strange to you, but they're explained in the book that I'm talking about here. And you can then begin to piece these things together. And what you will find is Scythianus is not only one of the hidden masters, maybe the most hidden master, but he's the master, according to Rudolf Steiner, of the physical body. So he has secrets to teach that are the future secrets. And so if you look into Scythianus's insemination into all these cultures and you try to find the golden thread, which I have done and friends of mine have done, what you will end up finding is that the mysteries now are to forge the Sampo. Well, the Sampo is a magic mill that gives, basically, it's turning your thinking, feeling, and willing into higher thinking, feeling, and willing, moral imagination, moral inspiration, moral intuition. But only the forgeman Ilmarinen can forge the Sampo at that time. And what does he do it for? He does it because his brother, who was basically Eros, or the creator, Wainamoinen, was the creator of everything. He sang everything into existence. Oh, what about Scythianus? He sang everything into existence. All the creation stories that he influenced were put into hexameter or pseudo-hexameter, so they'd be the perfect balance between breath and circulation in your heartbeat. And so these stories were told for practically 10,000 years, all through oral tradition, until people went along and gathered these stories up, found that they were very consistent across nations, particularly with individual languages. And they find that it's giving us a picture of the present. So Ilmarinen, we are the forgemen. We are the smithy. We are the blacksmith that is trying to hammer the gold in our blood into the radiant gold of plasma. So Ilmarinen is promised one of the daughters of Old Louhi, the queen of the north, or the old lady of the north. Her daughters ride on the aurora borealis, what's called the night rainbow. Plasma. So if the reward and the relationship you're supposed to have is with a rainbow maiden who rides on plasma, which is where angels appear, angels, archangels, and archai appear there, then if we forge the Sampo, then that is the fulfillment of the mystery of the sixth cultural epoch, where Scythianus will be the Manu of that period. And all we have to do is go back and look at Norse mythology, look at Odin and Frigg, look at Ragnarok, look at what happens at Ragnarok. We are in Ragnarok right now, folks. But Ragnarok, after the war of all against all, when the gods, the good gods, or the Aesir and the Vanir, fight against each other and cancel each other out by killing each other, and also the great demons of the world, the Midgard serpent, Fenris wolf, and Hela, are all defeated. That's our thinking, feeling, and willing. That's the forging of the sampo. That is the epic of our time. And we have to develop a relationship with the plasma. Now, plasma is sometimes referred to as Shambhala, or the white island above the magnetic North Pole. Now, in ancient times, the magnetic North Pole was different. So they would say that above the white island, which I pointed out is in the Gobi Desert, is the spiritual Shambhala, the spiritual white island, and only spiritual people can go there. Well, in the Kalevala, it says you're supposed to forge the magic sampo that gives gold out one side, salt out another side, and meal, in other words, a grain that has been ground. So, other words, life, salt we need for, and these three, and gold. That's the gold of the heart. That's not the gold of economy. And salt is the salt also in your blood. And so really what we're talking about is the sampo is your heart. So you have to forge your heart into something that can wed a maiden of plasma, a maiden of the aurora borealis. That's what it says. Now, in Norse mythology, that's Kalevala, that's Finnish mythology. In Norse mythology, also inspired by Scythianos, it says that when the war of Ragnarok is over, what we would call Armageddon, or the war of all against all, we cross another rainbow, because it used to be that the humans would leave Midgard and cross, or the gods would come down the rainbow, down to humans, to the Middle Earth, from where the Aesir live. And so Odin and Frigg, Odin would often come down to the earth over the Rainbow Bridge, but only a god could come down. But after Ragnarok, the children of the gods can go up a new rainbow bridge into the new heaven. Well, this is an exact description of what's going to happen to human beings over a long period of time. That's a given. That's a fact. But so even to finish the 6th and 7th periods, it takes 36,000 more years. So we have a long time to forge the sampo. We have a long time to wait for the war of all against all, unless things go bad early, which they can. So it is our child. Who is our spirit? That's our child. When you go into the spiritual world, you're birthed as a child, unless you're a great master being, avatar, or a bodhisattva or something, and it's a little bit different. But for most human beings, when they die, they're born into the spirit, and you're born as a child. And so we have a long time to do this. And that's the reason that the Manus, like the Manu of Atlantis, like Mani, the Manu of our time, like the Manu of the next period, Scythianos, they're always here to lead us. We just have to be sensitive enough to see the trace of their footsteps. And this is the key factor. We already have plenty of knowledge. We need to turn it into wisdom. And how do you do that? You study the works of the great beings that have been sent as avatars who have come from heaven, or in some cases, bodhisattvas who rise into Buddhas, or in some cases, because a Manu can be an avatar, or it can be a human that rises up into that level. But the point is, we're all on this path. We're all on this ladder. And if we look at the ancient past, we can get the natural clairvoyant wisdom that they had by studying their works and believing them. But we must put them in perspective historically. If you read the laws of Manu right now, some of them are 100% applicable because they're talking about imperishable spirit. But some of the laws of these cultures that were inspired by these leaders are no longer applicable. So when Manu sent these emissaries to India, it was to develop an understanding of the etheric body, of the sentient body. And why is that? Because the Atlanteans, through the 7 races, were supposed to have developed, by the 5th race, a human being that could really develop this capacity of intellectual development, or what Steiner calls intellectual clairvoyance, instead of natural clairvoyance, which is kind of vague and dull, natural clairvoyance. Intellectual clairvoyance is exacting, very exacting. That's the reason we try in all of our books to be very exacting. We give you tons of Steiner quotes, and then we explain them to you because some of them are somewhat inexplicable. And then we give you the modern research, and then we tell you what you can do with it, because that's the only thing that's going to empower you in this age. And that's the reason that our series of 22 books, I believe, on the works of Rudolf Steiner, from the works of Rudolf Steiner, answered the burning questions of my students in Waldorf education and in anthroposophy studies over the decades that I've been teaching. And so we tried to answer those questions. But then John Barnwell, who's been my beautiful editor and proofreader and cohort to make sure that I didn't make mistakes in this, we have worked so hard to prepare these things to help those people who are just beginning. So we have books on enlightenment, books on life after death, all the major burning questions. But then we try to give some books on the very deepest questions of anthroposophy that literally, in some cases, no anthroposophist has ever written about. And in this book, there are many aspects of that. Now, recently, there have been a couple books on Scythianos. They did a somewhat good job, somewhat superficial, but at the same time, it was good. Or you have the lectures of Virginia Cease, which we include in this book, about these master beings. But there's a tremendous amount of confusion. There are people in this day and age who call themselves anthroposophists who try to say that Rudolf Steiner was the great master Serapis. That's complete and absolute nonsense. Not only because Rudolf Steiner pointed out it was nonsense, and never ever quoted Serapis or said he was in contact with Serapis. He basically was working with the Western masters, Christian Rosenkreutz, and basically the master Jesus, who is Zarathustra reincarnated. Now, these beings, these higher beings in the 4th century gathered near the Black Sea, because at that time, the Sarmatians and the Scythians, who were also many other names, they were called the Saka, they were called the Sakai, they were called the worshippers of the sky. They had 1,000 names, literally. And so they were in a highly developed culture that had come from the last place that we know of that Scythianos incarnated, which is an island called Solovetsky Island, which is right near the White Sea. And Rudolf Steiner pointed out that this was the center of the Northern Mysteries through Scythianos, right? So this just so happens to be right next door to Karelia in Finland. And if you cross the border, the Russian city there is called Archangel City. And that is where the Finnish story of the Kalevala clearly describes the stone that had to be found to be used as the forge to create the Sampo. So the reason we know this is because Ilmarinen had to look and look and look until he found a stone that had the radiant colors of the rainbow coming out of it. In Finland, there's only one place, and that's where you get shungite. There are 3 mines of shungite in the world where it's actually high quality, good in large amounts, and they are right there. They're all right there, and it is very, very possible that shungite is a meteorite that came a long, long time ago and is degenerated. But you find C60 and other miraculous things there. So once again, Scythianos is the master of the physical body. What is he telling us about the physical body? Here's what he's telling us. He's telling us that we need to understand plasma and marry it, one of the daughters of the rainbow of the north. He's telling us that shungite obviously has something to do with human beings and the forging of the Sampo. Now, I could go extrapolate my speculation on that, but I'm not going to. But for sure, that is part of the story. He tells us that we should look at relationships, just like all the heroes in the Kalevala want to marry a rainbow daughter. In other words, an aurora borealis daughter. They're obsessed with it. They could have anything in the world. Ilmarinen created a woman out of silver. He created the sun and moon again, but he could not create the daughters of the rainbow who he wished to marry. Same thing with Wainamoinen, same thing with Youkahainen, same thing with all four heroes mentioned in the Kalevala. So that's another thing he's teaching us. What else did Scythianos teach us? He taught us that if we understand hexameter, the rhythm between your breath and your heart, then that is what you can write the anthropogenesis and the cosmogenesis, the creation of the cosmos, the creation of human beings, the history of human beings is written upon the heart. And the stories that he gave us, we don't even have the stories of the shamans of the Siberia, but the ones that I've found are directly aligned with Tampa Shinrab Miwoche and many of the things that Scythianos taught. And so we also were taught by Scythianos, who was probably the first breeder of horses, because it came out of Outer Mongolia, these little horses of the steppes that conquered the world, and chariots, and the wheel, and horse-drawn chariots. That's all Scythians. And it's also Tampa Shimrabmi, which I kind of wonder sometimes if they're not connected somehow, but I'm not going to speculate on that. And then we find out that because they were a migratory group, the Scythians, and they migrated further than anybody that I know of in history, they had to have an annual plant that feed their animals, feed them, and then be what they really needed. All cultures have this. They have something to transcend reality. And so with that culture, it was called soma. With the Bompo culture, it was just called cannabis. With the Scythian culture, it was called the mix of a hybrid between hemp and cannabis. But cannabis was used for elevating your consciousness to have spiritual experiences. Now, one might think, oh, this is just like, ganj or hash, or the different, what do they call it in India? On every street corner, you can get this bhang, it's called. And they mix it with ghee. And that's the reason people are confused. They think soma was ghee, milk. No, it wasn't. It was the milk of the hemp plant, because it refers to it many, many times. And we put it in the book to prove it to you, that it was a plant and that it was an annual plant. It wasn't a perennial. And that it was used to feed the horses. It was used to make clothing. It was used to make their houses. It was used to make everything. And as we know now, there's nothing that you can't make out of hemp. You can make your whole house out of hemp, practically. You can make almost anything out of hemp. So this is what Scythianos was teaching us. Now, I have to imagine that Scythianos, when he was going on his migration across the northern parts of Europe, Asia, all the way across to America, as I pointed out, he, in his many incarnations, like all the priest kings, just like Zarathustra, just like Manu, he certainly would have ran across Manu and the city of Manu. So this cultural infusion is something that those beings work on together. They made a commitment to each other in Hibernia, around the islands of Ireland. They made a commitment there that they would continue to try to take the ancient wisdom, no matter what form it was then turned into, and all these cultures they influenced, and that they would make sure that it was turned into a synthesis so it could be passed on to our age. And this was their mission. So from the White Island, from, let me say the right name, Solevsky Island in the White Sea, there were migrations that were led by Scythianos south, very far south. Steiner says all the way to Italy and to Rome, and even further south to Sicily, and even further than that. Well, those mysteries then mixed with the southern mysteries. And what we have then is a meeting in the 4th century, where Scythianos, the master of the physical, Zarathustra, the master of the etheric, Mani, Buddha, the master of the astral, and Mani, the master of the ego, all got together and they made a commitment to carry forth this wisdom. Now, again, there was a meeting that we describe in a number of our books where 12 great masters got together and they were around the being of Christian Rosenkreutz, and they did the same thing. They made a commitment to take the ancient Tao, to take the ancient magical language. The Atlanteans could use their voice to tell trees how to grow into their houses. They could use seeds to create energy that would literally be able to give their vessels the ability to fly through the air or move on the ground or even move on water or underwater. So when you germinate seeds in a very quick way, it gives you infinite power. Imagine the seed of a sequoia, which is about this big, growing to the largest tree on the earth, 4,700 years old. That's what a seed can do. So Manu, Scythianos, Zarathustra was given the credit for domesticating pigs, sheep, cattle, and other things that we basically eat. He also was given credit for creating the grains, most of the grains, and many of the vegetables. But it was Scythianos who was given credit for horses and dogs and the chariot and the compound bow and the first cultivars of hemp and cannabis, as well as many other things they grow in these northern climes. Now, in the northern mystery stream, there's different qualities than were developed in the southern mystery stream. And then they had to mix, and that was my point about Scythianos coming all the way down into southern areas, which were really part of the migrations of Manu. Now, I want to read a little bit about this because this is directly Rudolf Steiner's words. And I just want to give you a sense of this so that you don't think that I'm confabulating or sticking things together. Rudolf Steiner says in the very opening first lecture of Atlantis and Lemuria, chapter 1, from the Akashic Records, it's called, he says, in the little book, The Story of Atlantis by William Scott Elliott, the reader will learn that the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean was once a continent, that for about 1 million years, it was the scene of a civilization certainly very different from ours of today, and that the last remnant of this continent was submerged nearly 10,000 years BC. There it is, the first ice age. Details completing those given in that book and bearing on this hoary civilization will be given here. While the outward events of the life of these of our Atlantean forefathers are more conspicuously the subject of description in the above work, the work by Scott Elliott, something will here be said of the soul life and of the inner nature of the conditions under which they lived. The reader must therefore go back in thought to a period lying more than 10,000 years behind us and to a civilization which had existed for many thousands of years. So he literally is linking on to William Scott Elliott, but he's saying that they talked about the outward things. He's going to talk about the soul, about the inner capacities, about the intellectual capacities that are developed, and all the things that actually matter to us. It doesn't really matter what happened on Atlantis, except that the migrations then led us in the 5th, 6th, and 7th migrations to basically defame the races that came off at that time, which then mixed with everybody. There's no such thing as an Atlantean race that still exists. They mixed with everybody because there were Aboriginal cultures wherever they went. So Rudolf Steiner uses those 7 migrations off of Atlantis, 7 races, they're called by theosophists, and he describes them. Now, I'm only going to mention a few of them. The 4th was the Turanian. Now, when you talk about, the people want to talk about Tartaria, or they want to talk about the ancient powers to be able to build things with their voice, those are the Turanians. The Turanians still had the black magic power. They used it for black magic. They hadn't developed into the humans that we are now. So they misused it. They were the ones who were helping cause the sinking of Atlantis, the Turanians. Now, there are Turanians mentioned in history, and those Turanians they had a language different from all other languages, and they were the forefathers of the Sumerians, who were worshippers of black magic. So these things are then confirmed by modern research if you look into it. Now, I want to mention a few things that the Northern Stream gives as capacities, because we know what the Southern Stream gave us. We know what Manu's culture that developed these cities and developed the ancient Indian, ancient Persian, ancient Mesopotamian, Egypt, Greco-Roman, and our period, called the Consciousness Soul period, since 1413. And for that time, it is, of course, Christian Rosenkreutz and Mani who are leading us. And of course, Mani becomes the great leader in the future. But the point is that the teachings of Rosicrucianism are the fulfillment of the commitment of those beings I talked about, both in the 4th century BC and the Black Sea, and also what the people, the great masters gathered around the wondrous child, who was Christian Rosenkreutz reincarnated, made a commitment to give us. But they are different. The southern and northern streams are different. There's also an east-west stream, there's a west-east stream, and there's a middle stream. But Steiner talks principally about the north and south. And we also have anthroposophists who write about these streams extensively, and we've summarized them and put them into the book so that you'll have that and not have to go read all those books also. So let me just read a few things that Scythianos was trying to develop that was different from what Manu was trying to develop. He said that the northern stream, its task was to develop the I am, the ego, for the consciousness soul, which is our age now, through the courage mysteries of the earth. What do we need in our age? We need courage to face these things. And the only thing that can help you through is the I am of Christ. You can't defeat evil now. We can't. We have to acknowledge evil, call it out, and see if the light of Christ can dissolve it through the power of Christ, not through our power. But this courage, imagine Scythianos' courage to be able to go through all those cultures, time after time after time, incarnation after incarnation, going to a new culture, learning the language, taking their entire cosmogenesis, anthropogenesis, putting it into an epic or their sacred teachings, their mythologies, and they are still, in some cases, alive today, still being recited 12,000 years later. Amazing. So the Northern Stream worked out of the earth through human willpower. Human willpower is the most mysterious of all aspects of the human being. Scythianos is the most mysterious of the masters. He is the master of the physical body. So he is the one who told us to basically use the hybrid of hemp and cannabis for our physical bodies. Why? Because the endocannabinoid system is the master control system of the ductless glands, the endocrine system. He knew this, obviously. And so he's the one who pointed us in the direction of these things, so pointed us in the direction of the plasma, of creating the sampo and how to create the sampo and what it is we're looking for. And literally, we have to thank him for so many of the things in our culture. But unfortunately, many of them did lead to a warrior culture. But also, it led to a culture of high spirituality, where soma, or the nectar and ambrosia of the Greeks, on and on and on, all cultures that he affected, they had a magical drink that they could drink that could reawaken this natural clairvoyance in the human being, but on a higher level. So this is the willpower of the human being. So he basically was also developing, of course, breeding horses and dogs, and in some case cattle, and all the things that I mentioned. He also would be considered the Apollonian mysteries, or the mysteries of Hyperborea. And so when you talk about the golden bough coming from Hyperborea, and that they each year go to Thule or this Hyperborean island, and they get this golden bough, it is very possible, I can't say for sure, but I speculate that they may have been talking about going up to this island of Scythianos in the north, and they're receiving a new inspiration or a renewal of their understanding of these ancient mysteries. So this goes on and on and on. There's a whole list of things here, but essentially, The Scythians uh, they had massive influence upon the Druids. And Scythianos, I used to say to John Barnwell, my dear friend, look, where was Scythianos during the mystery of Golgotha? And it took me a long time to figure this out, but he was so clairvoyant that he was able to witness the mystery of Golgotha and teach it to the northern stream, which then was the Celtic stream, the Druid stream. And of course, we know St. Columba and Bridget and others witnessed Christ's mystery of Golgotha as it happened without being there. And this is what Scythianus did. So he was able to witness it from the spiritual world. But he also holds them the secrets of the future. So when we look at Manu, we're looking at the secrets of the past, and we are finding out that so many things Rudolf Steiner said were 100% true and able to be proved by many different scientific methods. And then when we look at Scythianus, we not only look at the past, we look at the future. And we look at what human beings are going to become, because Scythianus is a human who will become a Manu, whereas Manu was an avatar who came into a human body. So between these two, you basically have the spectrum, the parameters for what a human being has from ancient time to the far distant future. So we invite you to take a look at this book, and we invite you to take a look at our series from the works of Rudolf Steiner. We have tried in everything that we presented to only present things that we could be certain were found in anthroposophy, and then we give you those references, or that we were able to confirm in the knowledge gathering, the information gathering in the outer world right now, that then coincides, that basically underscores Rudolf Steiner's wisdom that he presented in all of these things. So we're so thrilled that we've been able to do this. Again, I want to thank my beautiful wife, Tyler. When I say our books, some people probably wonder who I'm talking about. Anytime I don't say I, because I did none of this on my own. It is my wife, Tyler, Gabriel. It is we, and it is John Barnwell who's helped us, and teams of people on both sides working with me and working with Tyler who bring these to you. And we hope that they're helpful to you. And if you're a person who can't afford the books, fine. We have provided on some of our sites free ebooks. There's still ebooks out there for free. There's 125 articles. Our old 750 videos on YouTube are back up now again, so you can get access to those. I have my own site on YouTube, Douglas Gabriel, have 150 videos there. So we try to give you lots of free stuff because we believe that anthroposophy and spiritual science is a free deed. And so we have done almost all of this work completely free. And now, the most exciting news of all, my beautiful wife has taken all these fantastic spiritual science concepts and put them into the most beautiful lyrics and the most beautiful music that I've ever heard in my life. So you can actually go on to ourspirit.com, O-U-R spirit.com. You'll see it. The first thing you'll see is you can click on music. And when you do, you're going to find 8 albums there, 2 very, very, very spiritual albums directly from all of our spiritual work, and 6 that were part of our Aim for Truth work when we were doing geopolitical work. But those things, again, gifts to people. We don't want, in any sense of the word, to ever have a cult of the personality for Rudolf Steiner or for me or for anybody. There should be no cult of the personality. There should be an understanding that your personality is the master in your heart. And if you have invited Christ and Christian Rosenkreuz and the Master Jesus into your heart, or even Manu or Scythianus or Mani, then you can't really go wrong. And you really can teach yourself these things because they become self-evident through work, through study, what you would call suffering. Suffering is crystallized wisdom. So if you can, wisdom is crystallized suffering. So if you can suffer through studying what all these ancients have said and done, then you will arrive at the same things that we've arrived at. But if you also simply seek the Spirit, I can assure you that there are infinite amount of spiritual beings, avatars, bodhisattvas, Buddhas, Manus, who are willing to help you both in what they have given to the world that you can research, and in what they're able to give you right now directly from their own spiritual being. We can go into the etheric realm and we can work with their bodies that they've left behind, their archetypal bodies. And so all of these things Rudolf Steiner was able to tap into, and that's the reason he was able to give a very clear picture of these things. And the only reason that we are able to give you a clear picture about these things is because we are resting upon the wisdom of the past, and we are standing upon the shoulders of the great leaders of humankind.
Through science veiled in wisdom.